Alright everyone, we start off today with our first video talking a little bit about the follow-up that I promised people a couple of days ago to my Dark Winter video, because again, I'm seeing rumblings of at least some governments in the world potentially going back into lockdown mode. They're trying to play up like the next flu season will be terrible. You've got the Lambda variant, Delta Plus, Epsilon variant, all of this COVID stuff. Now, you do have a counterfoil to that, which is that more and more people are getting tired of vaccine passports and masks and stuff. The nation of Iceland, their health minister just released an announcement you can look up yourself that I can't even mention on YouTube because it's straightforward and correct, and that's, of course, being right is difficult in an era of lies. First and foremost, before I get into this, keep in mind down below, if you're watching on YouTube, there will be a pinned comment with links to 4 other video hosting sites that I use. Again, keep in mind, 2 videos every single day only go on those sites. They don't end up on YouTube. This can be because of subject matter or simple algorithmic distortion on YouTube that punishes you actually for being a workhorse. So the sort of systems that you'd employ 10 years ago to increase your audience, they no longer work. Now YouTube rewards you only if you're astroturfed or if you're corporate controlled, and probably pays certain people to pretend to be organic creators in the vein of 2009 or something. Anyway, this is a basic concept for people who would want to stock up specifically because of human-created shortages. I'm not worried that COVID is going to start infecting potato plants. That's not going to happen. What does happen is people are infected with fear. It's a secondary pandemic. It's partially fed by governments, partially fed by the actual disease itself and its various incarnations as it mutates, which it tends to do. People have been trained fairly well to look only at case totals, not at the lethality of COVID or the demographics of those that are dying or becoming particularly sick, and so you still have a significant proportion of the population that's afraid. Now, fear, of course, is used by governments and non-state entities to exert control and get more resources. We see this. It's labeled the Great Reset, although it goes a little bit beyond that. But it's quite clear that there are attempts at the moment to usurp the normal commercial processes of the world. And my worry is that as flu season approaches, it will be a worse flu season, number one, and that worse flu season will be blown out of proportion. Flu can cause false COVID positives, so people are going to think there's like what are we on now, the 6th wave or something, and you might see business restrictions, manufacturing restrictions, etc. So here's a basic list of things, and these don't all apply to every person because your budget will be different. The availability of goods from place to place is different, certainly. The availability, certainly, of non-food goods even more so. For instance, if you're in the U.S., you can probably obtain a weapon. If you're in the Netherlands, you're not going to be able to obtain a gun. In most European Union countries, you can at least apply for one, but it's very much may issue with regards to that, generally speaking. I think the Czech Republic now is no longer on that list, though. I think there it's pretty close to the Second Amendment in the United States. So the Czech people, I guess you can hunt small game if your kids are starving. But here's a basic idea. First and foremost, there are 2 extremely important things, and you can survive on just those 2 things for an extended period of time. Keep in mind, water applies. Potable water is technically the most important if you're expecting possibilities of that not being available, at least as a clean resource. That's more of a shit hits the fan level situation. I'm looking more at a protracted shortage situation, compacted by unemployment, potentially looting and so forth. We've already seen that regardless of actual shortages. We've seen that in parts of the world just because of race relations, again, whipped up into a frenzy by the legacy media and by politicians for electoral purposes. Is it impossible to conceive that this might happen, especially in the U.S., ahead of the midterms? No, it's not. In fact, it's unfortunately likely because politicians like to cause suffering because then it gives them more power. So staple grains and staple legumes. You may not be a fan of black beans and rice. Okay, well then maybe get some oatmeal and maybe you like kidney beans. It doesn't really matter, and attendant to this, keep in mind, spices are very, very cheap. Salt is not expensive. Black pepper's not expensive. I like a lot of other kinds of spices, herbs, and seasonings. I'm a huge fan of like basil and coriander and stuff. You can fill the whole spice rack for not that much money. And those will last a considerable amount of time because you only need a couple of dashes of it per batch of food you're making. Now, keep in mind, there are different requirements, especially like let's say you got kids. Well, kids have different dietary requirements. Let's say you have a baby, infant formula or something may apply. Of course, breastfeeding's better, but formula might be what you have to do for some reason or another. You can live on rice and beans for a month quite easily. Is it tasty? I can make it tasty with the right spices and stuff. Of course, that would require as well some oil or fat of some sort to go with it. I like to put a dash of olive oil or something in the rice. A little bit of butter actually is the best, but doesn't keep forever. Lard. Lard makes sense. Fats are kind of important for many cooking sort of things. If you're not a vegetarian or something, I would say jerky. Beef jerky is fairly cheap. You can get any sort of canned or tinned meat like fucking sardines, which are also fairly healthy, omega-3 fatty acids, vitamin D. That'll be important potentially as we enter this dark winter. Fish products probably are fairly high on the list. Jerky and like basic canned meats though are the cheapest. Anything that is dried or canned or has been like salted, smoked, etc. will stay longer. Keep in mind, if you're looking at we're going to have a shortage for a week. People are going to flip out short term, maybe 2 weeks, like the last COVID shortages we had last year. You don't really need to look into long-term storage. It's not necessary. If, though, that is compacted by economic woes and turns into a Great Recession sort of situation, I hate to tell you this, but as hyperinflation occurs, you could see prices skyrocket. What would happen is that even though right now you've got a couple hundred to set aside to prep for a few weeks, maybe that $200 that right now will buy weeks worth of food will only buy a few days worth of food maybe sometime this winter. I'm not predicting this. I'm hoping it doesn't happen. But the warning signs are already there. And keep in mind, when I talk about U.S. policy, a lot of people in other countries, they are flummoxed by this. You've got to understand the U.S. is a massive trading muscle. It's the top trading partner of China as well. If the U.S. is closed for business because of shipping restrictions, trade restrictions, travel and so forth, and shortages, trade can't happen because there's nothing to actually trade. There's nothing being manufactured to trade for those cheap goods from Asia. That could screw their economies, causing a ripple effect that also impacts all other major trading partners of both dipole countries, the U.S. and China, as well as some of the other major players. The problem is you could have a world correction. That is, all the bubbles burst at once. The currencies of the world become less valuable, income begins to drop, unemployment rises. It would be a Great Depression style situation. And the problem is, unlike in the past, when people would try to muddle through it, these days people are much more materialistic. The people who were in the Great Depression, a lot of them when they were young, before the Roaring 20s, a lot of them were rural, a lot of farming, self-sufficiency. There wasn't the same level of materialism we have today. People have become hyper-reliant upon computers, upon electricity, upon other people in clerical positions doing work for them. Many people don't even know how to grow food. So keeping that in mind, it would have an outsized impact. Also, population density is simply a lot higher. Again, people could starve. It is not impossible that we're modern, we have all of this technology. It can't happen again. Horseshit. In fact, it would be 10 times worse if it did. It could cause the collapse of countries, and you might have to be part of that. Another thing I would say is certain luxury items. Coffee comes to mind. Tea. Again, these are things that are stored for quite some time, if they're properly stored. You should get whole bean coffee in a grinder if you're looking at, a generational depression or something. It's cheap now. Tea certainly even more so. But it wouldn't be. It would become considered a luxury item. Its price would skyrocket out of sight. For the purposes even of trade, this would be important. Toilet paper comes to mind. Of course, during the last COVID lockdowns last year, March and April, toilet paper was basically sold out. I found it funny because I had sort of ignored that in favor of looking at the food aspect, but then food, of course, goes in one end and comes out the other. It's important to be able to wipe your ass. Liz actually made me get an extra 8-pack, and it was funny. I think the amount we had on hand would have lasted, but only just barely, and having the extra toilet paper was kind of helpful. So thanks to Liz for that. Another thing, oils and fats. Again, as I said, lard will store long term. Butter under the right conditions for quite some time. Any sort of oils, things like that. I know some of you are like, well, vegetable oil and seed oils aren't good for you. Okay, there's a difference between something that is going to improve your ability to cook something meaningful intermediate term and going on a health food binge. And not everyone has their own sunflower field and press or something like that. And that's the other thing. Make sure to give, if you have it, having a piece of land is a good idea. And even here, like in the Netherlands, population density here is high. Like this little garden area, if I were to fully landscape it, I could get my kitchen herbs. I could have some potted tomatoes, cucumbers, zucchinis, and stuff like that. I could certainly have some carrots and onions. I could put all that in. But it would, while it would help if there were chronic shortages, food stamps, and bread lines and stuff like that, it wouldn't do everything. But you can get a garden house here. You literally somewhere out further from the city center, they have these areas where you can rent a plot or buy a plot. And it's not huge, but you can grow a lot more on it. And the price is intermediate, I would say. I could get one now, but I'm not looking into investing into a garden house when I haven't even landscaped back here. To be clear, I'm not expecting a Great Depression, but I am expecting, unfortunately, the high likelihood of shortages over the course of the winter. And of course, winter in the Northern Hemisphere, you're not going to be growing anything. So this is maybe secondary. This is if you're expecting it to last for a longer period of time overall. Solar lamps. One time in Rutland, we had a power outage, and it lasted for like 4 days intermittently. Like for the first 48 hours, there was almost no power. Like it came on for half an hour or so. I remember Mom took a shower, and everyone went to the bathroom, and then it went back off again. And it was the middle of winter. It was quite cold. It was because of an ice storm, actually. Thankfully, it wasn't like sub-zero. It was just normal New England winter cold as opposed to abnormally cold New England winter cold. One of the things that came in the most handy were those little lamps. You put them outside in your garden, and they have a little solar panel on top, and then they stay lit for some hours. It extended the hours in which I was able to be productive. I could read, I could do indoor work and stuff because these things would stay lit for 4 or 5 hours after the light had fallen. Half a dozen of these are not very expensive, and they come in various designs. Some of them are more long-lasting, more bright. We just had some of the basic cheap ones from Dollar General at the time, but I had like a dozen of them, and they worked. Hang them in the windows, and then you can navigate through your house without tripping over yourself because there's no electricity and therefore no light, and you don't have to exhaust your flashlights, and it came in very, very handy. They also have things like they have little hand-cranked rechargers, and you can get like one of those little radios that are battery powered and just an extra set of batteries or something. Again, it's an entertainment source. It's potential if something big does happen. There's news available. There are emergency channels on the AM band, I believe it is. Some of them also do shortwave. If you've already got like a solar array or something, you're all set, but that definitely doesn't apply to the average person. I would say a gun and ammunition, again, as available. In some countries, you can't get that. But if you need to hunt small game for survival purposes, I don't know of any country in which you can't own a slingshot. That'll at least allow you to grab a pigeon or a duck or something like that. Could come in handy as well. Matches, lighters, lighter fluid, there's flint and steels, anything that can cause things to combust. Again, if you're expecting electricity to be off for any length of time, that could be literally a lifesaver, depending on the climactic conditions. And if it's winter, being warm is slightly important. Maybe get an extra blanket while you're at it. First aid kit, tools for basic wound dressing and stuff. Hospitals might be overloaded. This is already beginning to happen. They're putting people in the ICUs that I don't think always necessarily truly need to be there. People can't get their chemo, so how much less are they going to be able to dress your wound when you slash your thumb open? Well, you're not bleeding out. You're not in imminent danger of dying. You might have to dress that yourself. A first aid kit is fairly cheap. I would say ameliorate that with antibiotic ointment, probably several different types of it. Again, as necessary, basic surgical tools, and a guide to field medicine. You can get them vintage off eBay or Amazon, and you can learn how to dress wounds at a level beyond putting a Band-Aid on the cut. And then, again, tools. Keep in mind, the can opener is important if you've got canned goods, except the cans that open with a tab, which is not all of them. If you're doing any gardening, having tools, because this dark winter could last well beyond the winter. And the worst case scenario is a Great Depression occurs because of the mismanagement of Western economies combined with paranoia over COVID and possibly influenza. That's the worst case scenario. Thankfully, it's not the most likely. Unfortunately, the most likely scenario I see is another economic downturn, another round of lockdownism, and this, regardless of whether people resist and prevent it from being fully implemented, almost doesn't matter, because then you have riots. You certainly would have people stockpiling. It will still lead to shortages. It would still, any restrictions will create a rise in unemployment and a glut in manufacturing. If that happens, like we saw before, China was all messed up because U.S. pork manufacturing was down, and China is a huge absorber of U.S. pork. Multiple large companies went out of business. Trust me, only the very, very largest businesses ever get the golden parachute bailout treatment. Anything in the secondary sphere, even if it's hundreds of millions of dollars worth of assets, they'll just get gobbled up by other big guys. Then they may not even be able to restore manufacturing right away. Right now we see the billionaire class essentially using COVID as a methodology to compact more and more power. The problem is that they then have more and more leverage over Congress, and this isn't just in the U.S., and that makes the problem worse. We're setting ourselves up for possible disaster. So there's a brief list. And keep in mind, you can obtain the basic necessities for under $100. If you're just sticking to the staple grain, the staple legume, some canned shit, and a few spices and herbs to taste, not everyone likes cardamom, not everyone likes coriander, it's not going to cost that much. And you'll have several weeks of extra supply. Again, I would add like a 10-gallon jug of potable water, just for cooking and drinking purposes. You can get water from the friggin' river or from your rain gutter to flush the toilet, by the way. Did you know this? You can flush a toilet without electricity as long as you've got an external source of water. There are people actually out there that for some reason aren't aware of this. So I hope that this doesn't happen. I hope I'm giving you advice in vain, and that things stay relatively normal, but again, you're beginning to see it creep back in. There's more resistance this time, which is good, and it's not happening in every country, which is even better. But it could still cause major problems. I certainly will be going on a fairly decent shopping run fairly soon. We don't have our kitchen cabinet set up yet, so I'm not going to do it. And I don't want, rice sitting all over the floor, but I will be getting some staple goods just to make sure that we can eat in case there are shortages. Again, it's better to be prepared and look a little bit paranoid. It happened before. But then again, I saw some of the coronatarians wearing like almost full-on hazmat suits walking through the airport. Who's paranoid? The person that wants an extra 10-pound bag of rice and some lard? Or the person who's walking around like they're on the surface of the moon? Keep that in mind and don't worry too much. That's about all. Peace out.